My mom's new boyfriend tried to replace my dad and slowly took control of our home, but I collected proof of his manipulation and finally exposed him. That was the only way I could save my mom and rebuild our family. My name's Emily Carter, I'm 32, and my family's always been messy in a we love you but we hurt you way. Mom, Linda, and Dad, Mark, separated when I was little. He drifted in and out for years, flights of presents, then months of silence. Mom held down 2 jobs, learned to be both shield and storyteller, and swore she'd never be alone again. She dated here and there, but nothing stuck, until Gavin. Gavin is the kind of man who smiles like a feature and moves like he owns a stage. He seduced Mom in chapters. Charm, small gifts, photo ops with her favorite coffee brand. He was younger than Dad, more polished, and he made Mom laugh in ways I hadn't heard in a long time. I wanted her to be happy. I really did. But something in my ribs kept tightening whenever he was around. Small things at first. He joked in a way that made my skin go cold. He would linger near doorways, and he had a habit of forgetting to leave when Mom said she needed space. Here's the part most people won't expect. I still talk to Dad. Quietly. Not because I'm trying to sabotage my mom. Not because I romanticize the absent father. Because Dad and I have a language. Honest awkwardness. The kind of conversations you only get when someone has been imperfect and then shows you that they remember the small things. Sometimes he calls to ask about a recipe I once made. Sometimes he sends a photo of a yard he's trying to rehab. We're not cozy. We're 2 people who survived a family treadmill and found a way to say hello across it. I never told Mom because, well, our family's dynamics are complicated and protective silence was a currency. When Gavin appeared in Mom's life and moved in after 3 months, she joked, he's my safety net. I didn't tell her I'd spoken to Dad that morning, as I always did, or that Dad said he'd stop by the hardware store that weekend. I thought I could hold both threads quietly. I didn't know then that silence would grow teeth. Gavin's first few months were a montage of perfect dates and Instagram captions. Backyard barbecues with 2 perfect grilling photos, Mom laughing with her head thrown back, Gavin's arm across her shoulders in pictures that got dozens of heart emojis from extended family. He passed the smile test with everyone. Neighbors, church ladies, my co-workers. He was attentive in public and calculated in private. At home, things were different. Gavin had a way of reframing mundane moments into punchlines at someone else's expense. He teased Mom in ways that made her flush and laugh, then turned the teasing on me with a casual cruelty that wore like grit. She's so delicate, he'd say when I voiced opinions, letting his tone carry the meaning. Fragile, manageable, not to be trusted with important tasks. When I pushed back, he'd smile and say, I'm just joking, can't you take a joke? Which of course, is an old gaslighting script that leaves you apologizing for feeling bad. He also had small rituals that made me uneasy. He'd position himself between Mom and the front door in a way that screamed territoriality. When Mom took calls from Dad, quietly, short calls at odd hours, Gavin would drift into the kitchen and clear his throat loudly, like an unspoken reminder that someone else was trying to reclaim space. He'd pick a topic and repeat it, creating a private syllabus of what could and couldn't be discussed in the house. The first time I said, can we not make everything a joke? He narrowed his eyes and said, you're acting like this is serious, Em. It's just banter. Those small things snowballed. There was an afternoon when he went into my phone, claiming he was organizing our shared calendar, and scrolled through my texts with a casualness that felt like trespass. He smiled when he found a message thread and then said, oh, who's this Mark that texted you at 3 a.m? I answered evasively and felt the shift. Privacy eroded into property. I wanted to tell Mom, to say, this is not okay. But the script in my head was older and louder. Protect Mom's happiness at the cost of my own unease. I told myself I was overreacting. Meanwhile, Dad kept calling. He'd ask how Mom was, sending voice memos of the birds outside his house. I would hear him in the background and feel comforted. I told myself those calls were harmless, but lying by omission is its own kind of poison. I didn't yet see that the day I refused to let the poison be named would be the day Gavin would start testing lines. I'll be honest. My relationship with my dad isn't that dramatic rom-com redemption people imagine. It's quiet. Grocery runs, text exchanges about which brand of paint to use. A voicemail on my birthday that always starts with a joke he thinks is hilarious. After the separation, he made small efforts, inconsistent, imperfect, but always present in the ways that mattered. Showing up for parent-teacher nights when he could, bringing a pie he'd baked at 2 in the morning because it was better than therapy. We developed a rhythm that suited us. Permission to be honest without the expectation of perfection. When Gavin entered my mother's orbit, Dad called more often. Maybe because he sensed change, or maybe because his own loneliness nudged him to reach. Our conversations became a lifeline. We'd talk about mundane things but also about Mom in ways that were both tender and practical. I told him about Gavin's comment that made me uncomfortable. Dad responded with the kind of patience that comes from having lost things slowly. Keep me in the loop, he'd say. I want you to be safe. Don't feel like you have to handle this alone. We kept those talks small and coded at first. The weird laugh, the time he stayed late, the look that suggested control more than love. I knew telling Mom would force a choice. I guessed it would hurt her. So I rationed the truth in tiny increments, telling Dad, I'm watching it, and telling myself I was protecting Mom's autonomy. But Dad kept nudging me with the kind of concern that's impossible to ignore. If there's something bigger, he said, you tell me, okay? I'll help. I started leaving little notes for Dad to find when we met in public. A napkin folded with a line like, call me when you leave the hardware store. It was covert, mundane, and felt like a crime only because our family had become practiced in private improvisations. When Dad came by to drop off a bag of soil for Mom's plants, Gavin answered the door with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He offered Dad a cup of coffee and hovered near the doorway in a way that suggested he was cataloging everyone's movements. I felt my chest tighten, and I began to measure time in small alarms. When Dad calls, when Gavin's mood shifts, what Mom laughs at. Keeping these conversations hidden felt like a betrayal and a necessity in the same breath. I told myself I was buying time to collect proof. A pattern of behavior would be harder to dismiss than feelings. I didn't know that the evidence would reveal itself faster than I expected. Evidence arrived slowly, then all at once. The first time I felt truly violated, Gavin didn't even realize he'd crossed a line. Mom was at work. I was in the living room grading a freelance gig. Gavin came in from the garage with a box and leaned against the doorway while I worked. He asked about my schedule in a way that sounded like curiosity but felt like surveillance. When I told him I'd be at a late gallery opening with friends, he cocked his head and said, "Are you sure that's a good idea?" That crowd. The subtext was clear. He knew who I should be around. Later that week, I returned home to find the front door ajar. Something Mom always locked even if she was just in the backyard. I called out and found Gavin standing in the kitchen, scrolling through my art portfolio on my laptop as if it were his own hobby. When I asked what he was doing, he smirked and said, "Just exploring. You have a lot of attention online. Thought I'd see what people see." His tone was mild. The action was not. It was invasive. I confronted him. I expected a flinch, an apology. Instead, he blinked like I'd invented offense. "I was just curious, Em. Relax." The casualness was maddening. He could pretend it was harmless because he had the luxury of age and the sheen of being a caretaker. I felt boxed. If I told Mom, Gavin would charm his way out, and Mom would shrug and say, he meant well. If I didn't, I became the one who needed to keep an eye on him. So I did the thing that felt both cowardly and sensible. I documented. I took photos of the laptop history, saved texts where he made jokes, and wrote down times he'd shown up uninvited. The stack was a small, meticulous ledger of boundary invasions. I started to see patterns, territory marking, gaslighting when I called him out, and minimizing when confronted. When I mentioned any of it to Mom, she told me I was being sensitive. "He's trying to be part of our life," she'd say. "Give him a chance." Her need to believe that she'd finally found a partner softened her skepticism like steam fogging a mirror. Dad urged patience but told me to keep evidence. "People with good manners are great at looking clean," he said over the phone. "But manners don't mean safety." His voice steadied me. I wanted to protect Mom without prying into her chosen happiness. But the ledger grew into a book, and I began to realize that protecting her might mean choosing sides openly, a decision I delayed for too long. It's strange how betrayal often rides the same vehicle as denial. I gave Mom pieces of the ledger, not the whole book, just a folded list with a few dates and short notes, thinking she'd see the pattern and step back. She took the paper, read it with the furrowed brow of someone thinking hard, and then looked at me like I'd suggested we cancel a vacation. "Emily," she said, sharper than I expected, "this is manipulative. You're trying to make me choose." That sentence hit me like a physical shove. From then on, the narrative shifted. Mom began to minimize what I showed her. If I said, "He scrolled through my messages," she'd say, "Maybe he was curious. He's new here." If I said, "He tries to block my texts with Dad," she'd smile and say, "He wants to protect our family from old ghosts." She translated my evidence into my insecurity. The more I tried to show, the more I seemed like an antagonist to her newfound hope. I questioned myself. Maybe I was too quick to see malice in everything. Maybe my protectiveness for Dad was spilling over. But then there were the things you can't easily explain away. The night he stayed up fixing the sink, until 3 a.m. and woke Mom with passive accusations about how tired she looked, the way he'd overhear private calls and then suggest they were evidence of old wounds. When I pushed back, Mom said, "I don't like you attacking the person who makes me laugh again." The gaslighting grew subtle teeth. Gavin would stage small dramas where he was the victim, she snapped at me today, and Mom would lean in with concern. I felt like I was witnessing a brainwashing in 2 acts. First, He isolated conversations that made Mom doubt her judgment. Second, he performed his hurt to turn Mom into a defender. Meanwhile, she started referring to him as my man, and introduced him to family gatherings as if we'd all known him for years. The dissonance made my chest ache. People in my life started to weigh in. Jess, my sister, urged caution but also urged me to slow my approach. "You're in deep, Em," she said. "Mom wants to be in love. Don't make her feel like she has to choose between you and happiness." Her worry was balanced with tenderness. I wanted to be loving, but I also wanted boundaries that were more than polite suggestions. I realized that loving Mom might mean being willing to be labeled the villain for a while. There's a moment that crystallizes everything. Small actions that then grow sharp as glass. Ours came on a Saturday when Mom was out at a book club. I'd planned a quiet evening of grading and a FaceTime call with Dad. Gavin, who claimed he was going to run errands, lingered in the kitchen playing with a coffee tin and humming. He asked if I'd mind grabbing groceries for him on my way out. I said no, I was staying in. He folded his lips, a small crease that read like disappointment. Not at me for refusing, but at the idea that I was refusing him. I walked to my studio room with my laptop and left the door open, a small gesture of trust. He followed and leaned in the doorway, making a comment about my aesthetic, and how it would benefit from a little less chaos. I told him to leave my work alone. He laughed, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a stack of papers. My notes, sketches, a letter I'd written and never sent to Dad years ago. He read a few lines aloud, smirking, then said, "You know, Em, people aren't as impressed as you think. Maybe you should be more present." That was when my patience snapped. I told him sharply to hand the papers back. He folded them and said, "I was just trying to help you see reality." I walked past him to the kitchen and grabbed a pen. My hands shook as I wrote down the time, what he said and where. It felt childish and necessary. Then he reached out and touched my arm, a possessive, small gesture meant to steady me. I flinched and moved away. His face went flat and then furious in a way that made the hair on my arms rise. Later that night, when Mom returned, the house smelled like citrus and this odd tension. Gavin was cheerful again, the kind of performative joy that comes with someone who's just won a private game. He offered to make tea. Mom hugged him, oblivious. I sat at the kitchen table with my pen and papers, and listened to him tell a version of events in which I was the one being difficult. Mom believed him. She said, "Maybe you're overreacting, honey. He's trying to help." I felt small and raw, like the air had been rearranged so my discomfort didn't fit anymore. That night I called Dad for the first time and told him everything. He listened with a quiet that felt like armor. "This is not okay," he said. "You've got to document everything." I did. I took photos of the drawer, saved the note snippets, and started to plan. The safety line had been crossed, and suddenly there was no going back to casual protections. Dad's the kind of man who's awkwardly good at being around people. The kind who brings a pie and stays to fix a loose hinge. When I finally asked him to drop by under the pretense of helping Mom with a yard project, he came with his toolbox and that earnest face that still gets me soft. I told him to be casual. Just swing by, say hi, and maybe help with the fence post. He did, and I watched him move with the quiet competence that's his love language. When he arrived, Gavin answered the door with too bright energy. He shook Dad's hand like a man who wanted to be evaluated and passed. They made small talk about tools and gas grills, and for 5 minutes it felt like nothing would happen. Then Dad lingered too long in the garage. He's a person who notices things, and came back with a small frown. He asked a question about an architectural picture on Gavin's phone, and Gavin's face shifted into a mode of control I'd seen before. Charm turned to guard. Dad noticed what I had described before, Gavin's casual surveillance posture, the way he minimized conversation about outside relationships. He asked me quietly if I'd been comfortable. My throat tightened. For once I didn't have to explain. He had a way of looking at Gavin that made the man uncomfortable in the way only honest scrutiny can. Afterward, Dad pulled me aside and said, softly, "He's small with boundary-pushing gestures. He's trying to shape the home." That day Dad and I made a plan. It was not an aggressive conspiracy. It was a practical checklist. Document behavior, avoid private confrontations without witnesses, and meet in public spaces for any discussion involving Gavin. He said he'd be around more, and for the first time in a long time, his presence felt like a shield. I felt relief and a new surge of guilt. Relief because help was near, guilt because I'd hidden this from Mom for so long. The air between Dad and Gavin was taut for the rest of the afternoon. Gavin tried jokes that fell flat. Dad answered with dry humor and directness. It was small, but it mattered. For the first time, what I'd recorded on paper had a witness who didn't translate my concern into drama. Mom still didn't see it the same way, she wanted to trust. But tonight she had to watch Dad, the man she'd married once, look at her new partner with a steadiness that made her pause. That pause would have consequences. Inevitably, the ledger and Dad's presence converged into a confrontation. It started small. Mom made us all dinner and invited Dad. It felt like a chance for family normalcy. Gavin agreed to come, probably because he liked the optics of inclusion. The meal was tidy at first. Salad, a roast, polite conversation. Then Gavin made an offhand joke about old ghosts, and Mom laughed. I felt a rattle in my ribs and pushed back. That's not fair to say about Dad, I said. Gavin's smile hardened. He said in a slow voice that everyone heard, "You talk to your father like he's still in the picture, Em. Maybe it's time to accept that he's not family anymore." The room froze. Mom blinked. Dad's jaw tightened. It was the tone, the attempt to erase our family history with a sentence, that stung the most. I told him, probably less calmly than I should have, that Dad was my father and she couldn't rewrite that. Gavin rose from his chair like a slow animal. He said, quietly but venomous, "If you keep this up, you'll make Mom choose." That phrase, "make Mom choose," was the key. It was a manipulation, a threat disguised as an observation. Mom recoiled and said, "Please don't say that." But the seed was planted. She looked at me with a hurt I hadn't authorized her to feel. "Why are you trying to make me pick?" she asked, voice small. I felt accused of sabotaging my mom's love life. The layers were cruel. Gavin had weaponized my loyalty into the argument. Dad stood and said firmly, "No one is making anyone choose. We're just asking for respect." The rest of the evening spiraled. Accusations flew. Words that will be recorded in my memory like a scratched track. Mom cried at one point, and I wanted to cross the table and hug her, but Gavin stood between us, stiff and defiant. I left the table in the middle of the dessert, my throat raw, and felt the house tilt in a new way. Loyalty had been framed as divisiveness. That night, I texted Dad a short. He said she'd have to choose. He replied, "Then she chooses us by choosing truth." His message felt like a lifeline. But that confrontation had opened a fissure in our house that wouldn't close neatly. Mom started to treat my relationship with Dad like a threat, not a relationship. The accusation of choice hung over our home like a storm cloud. There's a moment when patterns become undeniable. For us, it came when I found an audio recording on my phone. A voicemail Gavin had accidentally left on my device when he'd meant to send it to someone else. It was a short clip, him rehearsing what to say if Mom questioned his jealousy, his voice smooth and practiced. "Tell her she's lucky," he said into the voicemail. "Tell her everything about him is in the past and that you're the future." He paused, then murmured, "She'll believe the performance." I stared at the recording and felt my stomach flip. It was the kind of evidence that wasn't just about petty invasions. It was a recorded map of manipulation. Dad said we should play it for Mom with a mediator present. Jess said she'd back me up. I was terrified of the fallout, but also exhausted from holding the ledger alone. We arranged a meeting at my sister Jessica's apartment with a family friend who agreed to be neutral. The friend, Marie, is a calm retired teacher who knows how to hold space. I played the voicemail. The room was silent, the quiet like a held breath. When it ended, Mom looked at me with the expression of someone seeing a photograph for the first time. Stunned and disbelieving. Gavin, to his credit, tried to rationalize. He said, "I was practicing something I shouldn't have said." But the nuance had been lost in the recording's clarity. Mom's first response was to shake her head and say, "He's trying to help." Then she stepped out of the apartment and called him. I watched from the window as the two of them spoke, her face small and perplexed. When she came back in, she was different. The armor of denial had a hairline crack. I don't think she entirely believed me at that moment, but she had to reckon with a recorded voice that contradicted the man she'd chosen. It didn't all fall apart instantly. Gavin wept and said he'd never meant to manipulate, that he loved Mom. But the voicemail was a mirror that reflected back something he had tried to keep hidden. Mom sat with the contradiction like someone trying to reconcile two versions of a beloved figure. We had a long talk that night, and though nothing fixed overnight, the presence of proof meant the script had changed. Suddenly Mom's default of defending Gavin had to compete with the evidence in her hands. Once the voicemail was out in the open, things shifted quickly but not always cleanly. Mom confronted Gavin in a way she'd never confronted anyone before. Not with theatrics, but with a steady, tired voice that said, "I'm not a fool." Gavin faltered. His public performance crumpled. He tried to play the wounded, claiming I'd edited the clip or that it was taken out of context. Brave accusations are easy when you've practiced the art of plausible deniability. Marie helped facilitate a conversation where everyone agreed to pause for a week. Mom told Gavin to stay at a friend's house while she thought. It felt like a win, a literal breathing space. Gavin left with his things in a duffel, his face a mixture of anger and wounded pride. For a few days, The house felt like it might return to a place of ordinary noise. Dishes, TV shows, the small hum of normalcy. But the unravel continued beyond his departure. Gavin tried to contact Mom with apologies, gifts, and eventually, threats, in tones that suggested, "If you leave me, you'll regret who you leave behind." He posted passive-aggressive messages on social media about people who don't understand devotion. Dad followed up with lawyer letter caution because Gavin started to insinuate things in public that could have consequences. He wrote messages designed to shape a narrative that painted Mom as unstable if she left him. The combination of public posturing and private veiled menace made us nervous. Mom struggled with her own grief. She had invested emotion and the idea of a partner who got her. When he left, she vacillated between relief and mourning. It's hard to grieve the end of something that felt wrong without feeling guilty. She'd say, "He loved me," and then mortgage the sentence with, "But he also did this." Our family became a messy chorus of care. Dad showing up with sandwiches, Jess giving awkward pep talks, me insisting we change the locks and set firm boundaries. It was clumsy, but it worked. Gavin's attempts at influence eventually dwindled, partly because the voicemail had undermined his credibility and partly because legal warnings made escalation risky. He moved to another city rather than be present in the face of scrutiny. The house settled into a new normal. Quieter, guarded. Mom apologized for not seeing things sooner, but I knew apologies are slow like an old engine warming up. The harder work, rebuilding trust, had only just begun. After the dust settled, we laid down some basic rules. Locks changed, phone passwords updated, and we established a household code. No private deletion of texts about family decisions, and any new partner had to meet with the family informally before moving in. It sounded controlling on paper, but for us it was a safety protocol born of experience. Mom signed up for therapy and started to untangle why Gavin's words had felt so persuasive. She learned to name charm and to test it with questions she hadn't known to ask. Dad and I set up a schedule so he'd be around more without it feeling like surveillance. He met with a counselor at the suggestion of a friend to get tools for facilitating family conversations without scaring Mom off. Jess and I started to rotate home dinners so our presence felt steady, not adversarial. The tone in the house changed from accusatory to cooperative, still fragile, but warmer. There were awkward social ripples. Some neighbors took Gavin's side for a while, because charm is convincing. A few distant relatives judged Mom quietly for letting a man push her around, as if relationship abuse is a simple moral failing. Those comments stung. We learned to limit what family updates we shared on social media and who we let into our home. It was a small lesson about privacy and the prudence of transparency. Mom's therapy work was slow but real. She learned to keep a journal of feelings and to call a friend, not just Gavin, when something felt off. She practiced phrases like, "I need time to think," and "I'm not comfortable with that," until they felt like ordinary sentences, not declarations of war. The shift was subtle. I started to see boundaries show up where before there were only pauses. The house felt less like a game of property and more like a place people negotiated breath and space. We're in a place that feels, to me, like cautious repair. Mom's laughter returned in smaller, more private doses. She still enjoys coffee that tastes like dawn and calls Dad about paint colors at odd hours. Our family dinners are less performative and more about actual conversation, awkward but real. Mom no longer introduces someone new as "my man," in a way that makes our stomachs drop. She's learned to say, "This is someone I'm seeing. I'd like you to meet them slowly." I reconnected with my art in a way that was healing. Small collages that symbolize boundaries and a series of Polaroids of family moments we reclaimed. Dad is around more, but not to be a watchman. Instead, he's become this quiet, steady presence who shows up with pies and tools and a willingness to be in the small stuff. Jess and I joke more now, the kind of humor that stitches small wounds. We haven't closed the book on what happened. Gavin's occasional social posts will surface like a bruise for a week and then fade. He's moved away, but the impact of the months we spent adjusting still sits in the corners of conversations. Mom's trust muscles are rebuilding. She still hesitates before letting someone into her home for the night. She's learning to ask direct questions and to test answers with curiosity rather than automatic acceptance. As for me, I learned that protecting someone you love sometimes requires being willing to look like a villain for a season. There were nights I lay awake thinking I'd turned into the antagonist in my mother's happiness story. But I realized protection isn't sabotage. Protection is an act of love that can be messy and misunderstood. At times I still resent that I had to gather proof like a detective to be believed. But I also see the sturdier rhythms now. Locks that hold, a therapist's number in Mom's phone, and Dad's odd little pies appearing on our stoop. Update. 6 months after Gavin left, life feels quieter and less urgent. Mom and I have a weekly ritual, a Saturday morning coffee where we trade small grievances and plan silly projects. She's learning to knit, atrociously but enthusiastically. Dad calls more, often to talk about nothing and everything. Jess moved into a place closer to Mom for a while, so there's a steady, loving presence in the house. We've grown more protective of our privacy. We don't overshare family matters on social media anymore. Mom continued therapy and started a small book club with a few women she trusts. It's not radical, but it's a new way for her to get feedback beyond charm and romantic flattery. She's dating cautiously now, coffee dates, public spaces, friends around, and the language in our house around new partners includes questions like, how do they handle conflict? And do you feel heard? Those used to be invisible categories. Now they're standard. I'm less anxious in the house. I still keep my little ledger habit. I write down odd behaviors when they happen, but it's more a tool for conversation than a shield. I taught Mom to make a safety box, copies of important documents, a list of trusted contacts, and a key stash with a neighbor. It felt practical and oddly empowering for both of us. If there's anything I want to leave here for someone who might be reading this and feeling that pull of protective silence, document, don't gaslight yourself, and find witnesses you trust. Love sometimes asks us to sit in discomfort, but it should never ask us to hand over our agency. That lesson was hard-earned in my family, but it has made us softer and stronger at once. We still joke about Dad's pies. Mom and I laugh about how dramatic we were. Jess tells me I'm less of the responsible tyrant, and more of a strategic realist. I'll take it. The house still creaks, sometimes in the night, and I still wake to check the locks. But mostly I wake to the sound of someone laughing at the breakfast table, and that feels like progress.